everyone. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in to today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of now more than 300 library systems across the United States and Canada with the goal of making author talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the wonderful best-selling and acclaimed authors that you hear from throughout our series year-round. Today, we are so honored and so excited to have New York Times bestselling author William Kent Krueger with us to talk about his prolific and exciting body of work and to entertain us for the next hour. Welcome, Kent. How are you?
I am doing well, Brandon, and you are just the most charming host.
Well, let's get in there first before you make that assumption. Thank you for saying so. I am super excited to dive in, but I do want to give everyone a little bit of standard housekeeping information before we do that so that you know how to ask questions and everything runs smoothly. Then we'll learn a lot more about our guest. So we have compiled some viewer questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but we will also be taking your additional questions throughout this conversation. So when you have a direct question, you can go ahead and hit that questions button that's below the live stream video at any time to submit your question. If you have a question now, go ahead and submit that question now. In addition, we invite you to interact with your fellow viewers in the live chat box, also located below this live stream. It's always fun to see where everybody's tuning in from. If you're unable to attend the full talk for any reason, your baby starts crying, you have to eat dinner, you have to leave, any reason whatsoever, we're going to send you a link to the recording in about 24 hours. And a thank you for attending email. So you can come back and kind of pick up where you left off. So to formally introduce our guest for today, William Kent Krueger writes a mystery series set in the Northwoods of Minnesota. His protagonist is Cork O'Connor, the former sheriff of Tamarack County and a man of mixed heritage, part Irish and part Ojibwe. I'm sorry if I ruined that. His work has received a number of awards, including the Minnesota Book Award, the Loft McKnight Fiction Award, the Anthony Award, the Barry Award, the Dillis Award, and the Friends of American Writers Prize. Ordinary Grace, a standalone novel published in 2013, received the Edgar Award given by the Mystery Writers of America in recognition for the best novel published that year. The companion novel, This Tender Land, was published in September 2019 and spent nearly 6 months on the New York Times bestseller list. His last 9 novels were all New York Times bestsellers. Recently, a novella, The Levee, published this year in 2023, first of its kind by Mr. Krueger. He's been married for nearly 50 years to a marvelous woman who is a retired attorney, and he makes his home in St. Paul, a city he dearly loves, which we were just talking about before we went live. Welcome again.
It's good to be with you, Brandon.
Likewise. So you have been quite the busy man as of late, touring a lot of public libraries in Minnesota. How's that been?
I love doing library events. Now, particularly when I do the more rural libraries for a number of reasons. Selfishly, if I do a library event in the Twin Cities, a famous author was probably there the week before me. Not a big deal. But if I go to a rural library, authors are pretty rare there. So I get treated like royalty. So I love doing library events in the smaller communities. But I also am deeply committed to helping libraries provide important programming for their patrons. I think libraries are one of the important cornerstones of our democracy, access to free information. And so I do all I can really to support libraries.
That's wonderful. We thank you for that. Thank you so much. So Kim, well, several people, but I'm going to call out Kim here. Kim would like to know, when did you know that you were going to be an author, and how did you first get started writing?
Yeah, this is a question I get almost every time I do an event. So I have a story in that regard. Yeah, I have always wanted to be a storyteller, and I have always written. And I kind of blame my parents for that one. Because when I was a kid, I had parents who I hope, like the parents of everybody who's watching, read to me. When I was a child, I never went down for a nap. I never went to bed at night without a story being read to me. So I grew up thinking of the world in terms of stories. And, for whatever reason, I wanted to be one of the storytellers. First story I ever remember writing was a short story in the third grade. It was called The Walking Dictionary. Now, I got to tell you this, my father was a high school English teacher. And when I was a kid, he was always storming around the house ranting something like, nobody uses dictionaries enough. Nobody uses dictionaries enough. So in the third grade, I wrote a short story called The Walking Dictionary, which was in fact about a dictionary that didn't think it was being used enough. It magically sprouted legs so that it could, toddle off to the people that needed it. My third grade teacher went gaga over that story. My folks oohed and awed over that story. I swear to you, in the third grade, I knew I was destined to be a writer. So I have always written. I served kind of a long apprenticeship. I didn't publish my first novel, the first novel in my Cork O'Connor series, a book called Iron Lake, until I was 48 years old. But I was always writing.
Yeah. Well, thank you to your parents then for influencing that. That's
Yeah.
amazing. Do you have specific writing practices? Like, do you write a certain amount of time each day? Do you outline? And David and Michael both actually are mentioning your acknowledgments and how you mention a coffee shop where you sometimes write. So they would like for you to please talk about your writing process, if you don't mind.
Sure. I am very disciplined in my approach to my art. I think if you're an artist, I don't care what your medium is, if you're going to accomplish anything, I think you have to approach it in a disciplined way. So for the last 40 plus years, my alarm clock has gone off at 5:45 every morning, 7 days a week. I've gotten myself up and dressed. And before the pandemic made us shelter in place, I would go to a coffee shop where I would write. When I was working full time, I would only be able to write for maybe an hour and 15 minutes. But once I jumped ship and became a writer full time, I would spend 2 to 3 hours in the coffee shop. Until the pandemic descended, I wrote every one of my novels in coffee shops.
Wow.
Yeah. Again, just a very disciplined approach. I never have a particular word count that I'm shooting for or number of pages. Typically, I have an idea of what I want to accomplish in a day before I sit down. And when that's accomplished, then I, fold my notebook and call it a day.
Do you kind of just go where the characters take you, or how do you know to stop?
Yes.
Fall asleep?
Sometimes it's just like, oh man, I'm bushed. I gotta stop, because if I'm really tired, it's the prose is not going to be the fresh prose that I would really like it to be. So I found that after 2 or 3 hours, I'm really ready to call it. But very often I'll go back in the afternoon for another hour or an hour and a half. I really shoot to write creatively about 4 hours every day.
That's wonderful. Emily needs to know what's on your hat.
Galveston, says Galveston. I always wear a hat when I do an event, whether it's in person or virtual. And I won't tell you why. I think there are some things that need to remain a mystery. If you were ever to come to one of my events in person, you'd see me wearing a hat, regardless pretty much of the the hoity-toityness of the event. So yeah, this one says Galveston because every winter for the last several years I have spent some time in Galveston. I really enjoy that town. Great food in Galveston. But I have a whole array of hats. Galveston, the Apostle Islands, Minnesota, Sedona, you name it. I've got a hat from there probably.
Well, I'm glad that Emily asked. We were all dying to. So Janine wants to know, when you're writing and you're organizing in your mind, do you have the story kind of laid out already, or do you just let it flow?
Brandon, it depends on the kind of story I'm going to write. If I'm writing a story in the Cork O'Connor series, those are all essentially mysteries. And the mystery is a very tightly woven fabric of storytelling. Everything depends so significantly on everything else. And I think that the success of a mystery depends largely on the timing of the reveals, When do you give the reader the clues that are going to be necessary for solving the mystery at the heart of the story? So typically when I write a story in the Cork O'Connor series, I'll think that story through as completely as I can before I ever put my fingers to the keyboard. At the end of that thinking process, which can take weeks or even months, I know how the story begins, I know how it ends, I know who did what to whom and why, I know the themes that I want to weave through the story. But my standalone novels, Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land, particularly, I have a new standalone coming out. Let's see, how do I do this? Ah, I have a new standalone coming out in the fall. It's called The River We Remember. But for the standalones, Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land, the already published standalones, they, a mystery is an intellectual construct. It's a puzzle that comes out of your head. You are working very hard to make sure all of the puzzle pieces fit neatly together. Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land, for those of you who have read those two novels, came from a different place. They didn't come from my head. They came from my heart. And I wanted a process that would allow the reader to feel that I was speaking to them from my heart. So going into the writing of those two novels, I had no idea really how the stories were going to play out. I only knew a few elements that I wanted to include in the story I was going to tell. And then I let the story reveal itself to me as I was writing it. And it was, both of those were just really remarkable creative processes. But I would never write a Cork O'Connor story that way. If you, I have friends who write their mysteries that way. They just wade into it and discover it as they go along. But they often complain to me that they write up a blind alley, have to come back and go up a different way, or they'll wake up in the middle of the night going, "Oh God, what happens next? I don't know." I don't like to lose sleep, so I like the idea of planning the novels out. Now, that doesn't mean that things always work out the way I have intended. I try to leave myself open to changes. Every storyteller understands that at some point a story really does have it take on an energy of its own.
Yeah.
And as a storyteller, you have to step aside and let that story go where it wants to go, despite what you thought you were going to do with it. So I have let, even those that I thought I had outlined pretty significantly, I've let those stories go where they wanted to go. Sometimes they've taken me to places that really surprised the hell out of me. Sometimes they've taken me to places readers were not particularly happy with, but it was really the direction that the story dictated.
I can think of one of those moments. Somebody actually asked if you and your blonde lawyer wife got in a fight. I'm not going to spoil what happened, but I had to laugh out loud when I read that question.
Well, let me explain just a little bit. So for those of you who have not read any of my Cork O'Connor stories, Cork O'Connor is married to a blonde attorney. I'm married to a blonde attorney. And Cork has his view of the world, and Jo, his wife, often has her view of the world. And so very often they have to negotiate the place that they're going to both come to that they can live with, which in my 50 years, I've been married 50 years. In my experience, marriage is oftentimes a situation of successful negotiation. But Jo suffers a particular situation that when I wrote it and my wife read that manuscript, she came to me and she said, "Kent, do we need to talk?"
Okay, I'm glad I said something then, because that's a great story. So what do you find then? May is asking, what do you find to be the hardest thing about writing? Especially since you just kind of told us that two different approaches for standalones and mystery. Do you find the emotional approach more to be more rigorous than the intellectual kind of puzzle approach? What do you find the hardest about writing?
The hardest are the mysteries, far and away, because the thing that interests me most in the writing that I do are what I call the narrative elements. I'm interested in the language. I'm interested in the richness of the characters. Interested in creating a profound sense of place. I'm interested in the themes. Um, and and I have to have a plot on which to hang all of that. I think of the plot as the skeleton of the story, and all of these narrative elements supply the flesh, the beauty that makes us fall in love with the story. But you have to have a solid plot. You have to have a really good, solid skeleton. So I spend most of the time when I'm creating a Cork O'Connor novel, I am angsting tremendously over what kind of a believable, emotionally satisfying plot can I create, and then make it the most beautiful piece of mystery writing that I can offer. So I think for me, writing the mysteries have been more difficult. I have to be honest with you, both Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land, I felt like were two of the easiest stories I've ever written, and I think it was because they came from my heart. And the stories, I often felt like the stories were being given to me. I felt like I was simply the vessel for the telling of those pieces.
It's really I'm noticing a little bit of a theme in authors that we interview from time to time. Many of you say that you feel like a vessel for some of your novels. It's something to explore for sure.
Well, every storyteller, one of the reasons that we're storytellers is that we enjoy the magic that we're a part of. Things happen when you're a storyteller that are inexplicable. Insights come to you, words come to you, and you are not always certain where they came from. I personally believe that if you're a storyteller and you sink yourself deeply into the telling of a story, it's not uncommon to go someplace that's below conscious thought. And that when you come back up, you bring with you touch the universal. And when you come back up, you bring with you things that really are a little, outside yourself, beyond yourself. And love those moments because, and every storyteller has them, you simply sit back and you go, where the hell did that come from? Thank you, Lord,
Yeah, that's amazing. Matthew would like to know if you think that your storytelling has changed as you've gotten older.
Yeah, in my Cork O'Connor series, they're less brutal. In some of the early novels, I had some pretty high body counts. But as I've aged and mellowed, I have tempered the violence. I've always tried to be very judicious in my use of violence in the Cork O'Connor series. For those of you who have not read the series, people die, yeah, because that's what you do when you write a murder mystery or a thriller. But I have never tried to linger on the graphic details of the violence. The violence itself is less important to me than what was it that led to the violence, and what are the ramifications of the violent act. That's where I tend to spend my time. So I got lost in that. What was I talking about?
I guess how your storytelling has changed as you.
Oh, how it's changed. Yes. But I think I've become a better wordsmith over time. I was always, I've always been a pretty good writer. What can I say? My father was a high school English teacher. He taught me very early the power of words and how to use them
Do
correctly.
you still use a dictionary? Would your father be proud?
I have such a broad vocabulary now, but that's another thing that's changed. I spend time worrying about precise words, exact words, and the meaning of the words. Is this really the word I want? Does it really carry the meaning that I want it to have? And my dad would be very proud of me for that. So I think I have become a more powerful storyteller with time, and I think that's certainly true in the standalone novels. The language that I use in both Ordinary Grace, This Tender Land, and now the river we remember. StreamYard is like I'm on different sides when
it's not mirrored. So.
Yeah. So I consciously tried to elevate the language because they are different kinds of stories from mysteries. The language is a little more complex, a richer language, I believe, because these are the kinds of stories I thought that demanded that.
So Maggie wants to know, how do you keep, where does your inspiration and your ideas come from time after time for so many beautiful stories? But even, with the Cork O'Connor series, which we'll definitely dive into soon, how do you pace those? How do you always come up with a new plot line? How does that work?
I think if you're a storyteller, when you accept that you're one of the storytellers, it's like you open this door to yourself, and stories just start coming at you from all directions. They come at you from places you would expect. They come at you from places you would never expect. They come from stories you've heard, family stories that have been told down the ages. In the Cork O'Connor series, many of the stories that I've created arise out of issues that affect the interface of two cultures, white and Ojibwe. And often the issue at the heart of the story has been suggested to me by one of my friends in the Native community. And so I I'm open to suggestions. Now, for those of you watching, I don't want you to suggest a story to me. It's not what I'm asking for here, although I do get that all the time. For the Cork O'Connor series, I am so appreciative when one of my Native friends enlightens me about an issue that I haven't been, as a white guy, I haven't been aware of, and that am encouraged to write a story around, maybe to make the white reading public more broadly aware of it. So some of my stories come from there. Here's a good idea. Here's a good example of where a story might come from. The third book in my Cork O'Connor series is a book called Purgatory Ridge, and I had written already two books in the Cork O'Connor series, Iron Lake and Boundary Waters, and I didn't have an idea for the next book, and I was kind of spinning my wheels as I was thinking about what I might want to write next. I was working then at the University of Minnesota, a division of it called the Institute of Child Development. And one day I was having coffee, sitting on the coffee break, and one of the people I worked with came and sat down beside me and proceeded to tell me the story of the death of her father. Her father was a deckhand on one of those great ore carriers that ply the Great Lakes. It was an ore carrier called the Daniel J. Morrell. In the fall of I can't remember the exact date, fall of like 1967 or 68, as it was making its final passage of the season, the Morrell encountered one of those horrific gales that sweep across the Great Lakes in that time of the year. And in the course of battling that storm, it broke in half and it sank. It was the worst maritime disaster on the Great Lakes up until the Edmund Fitzgerald went down. 29 men lost their lives, but one guy survived. A guy named Dennis Hale survived that shipwreck. He survived for 3 days on an open pontoon raft, dressed only in his skivvies and a pea coat. That's all he had time to put on before he leaped into the raft. In those 3 days, the winds were 60 miles an hour, the waves were 30 feet high, and the water was just slightly above freezing. This guy should have died, but he didn't. It was this miraculous survival. And when I heard that story, I knew, okay, I know what the seed for my next book is going to be. I know what the story at the heart of it is going to be. So you have to be open, and stories do come to you from all different kinds of places.
Yeah, you have to be listening too. I mean, what if you missed it?
Well, most storytellers are really great listeners, we really are.
So we've touched on the Cork O'Connor series a couple of times now. Can you talk a little bit more about what that series is about, just for those who haven't started reading it yet?
Sure. The Cork O'Connor series, there are currently 19 books in the series. The first was Iron Lake. It was published in 1998. The most recent is, let's see, Fox Creek. I'll never get used to this. Fox Creek over there. It came out last fall. I set the Cork O'Connor series up north in the great Northwoods of Minnesota, in the fictional Tamarack County. Cork O'Connor is the fictional sheriff of the fictional Tamarack County, or he was at one time. And largely because and he's a man of mixed heritage. He's part Irish American and he's part Ojibwe, Anishinaabe. And because of that mixture in his heritage, and largely because of the area in which I've chosen to set my work, a lot of the stories that I write in that series come from issues that rise out of the interface of those two cultures, white and Ojibwe. So I've written about Indian gaming casinos and the effect that that's had both on the Ojibwe community and the surrounding white community. I've written about the influx of the drug and the gang cultures on the reservations. I've written about the really tragic situation that exists here in the Twin Cities and in other large metropolitan areas that have a significant Native population that involves the sexual trafficking of vulnerable Native women and children. Always at some level in my work, I try to deal with the whole question of racial prejudice. So that's the Cork O'Connor series.
So you said that you first published Iron Lake when you were 48. What inspired that first book? How did that come?
My father, the high school English teacher, had encouraged me to write the great American novel. When I was 18 years old, he turned me on to, he insisted that I read Ernest Hemingway, and I fell madly in love with Hemingway. I wanted to be Ernest Hemingway. And so I spent way too long trying to write the great American novel as Ernest Hemingway might have written it. Stupid on so many levels. But then I hit my 40s and a midlife crisis, and I thought, well, the hell with trying to write the great American novel. I want to write something somebody might actually want to read. So I looked around me to see what everybody reads. You know what everybody reads, Brandon? Mysteries. Everybody reads mysteries. It's a genre whose appeal cuts across all socioeconomic levels, all ethnic groups, all age demographics. So I decided I'm going to write a mystery. Now here's a confession coming from a mystery writer. Before I began to write mysteries, I didn't read them. That was the influence of my father, the English teacher, who had convinced me that mysteries were the poor stepchildren of literature. So I didn't even read Nancy Drew or the Hardy Boys when I was growing up. So I had a lot to learn about mystery writing, and I did it by reading. I began to read voraciously in the mystery genre, and I had the great good fortune of stumbling very early on a series written by a guy named Tony Hillerman. Hillerman was an icon in the mystery genre. He wrote a series that was set in the Four Corners area of the Southwest and that dealt significantly with the culture of the Navajo, the Dene. And when I read that series, I thought, nobody is doing that with the Ojibwe here in Minnesota. Maybe I should give it a shot. And that's what led me to include the Ojibwe as a significant element of my work.
Did you already have like people that were of Ojibwe culture that could tell you, yes, this is right, or no, this isn't right? Did you already have friends that were Ojibwe?
Not in the least. When I made that decision, I knew what I knew about the Ojibwe culture, the culture of the Anishinaabe, was about what every white person knows. Nothing. But I was a cultural anthropology major in college. And so the idea of learning about this culture, not my own, was a pretty exciting prospect. And I began, as all good academics begin, I began by reading. But in the course of my research, then I began to meet members of the Ojibwe community and form relationships that have, across the last quarter of a century, become important friendships for me. I rely on my Ojibwe friends for their advice, their insights, their perceptions, their suggestions. As I said, or maybe I haven't said yet, a number of the stories in the Cork O'Connor series have been suggested. The idea at the heart of them have been suggested by my Native friends. Whenever I have finished a manuscript for the series, I will typically give it to one, usually two of my Ojibwe friends to read and vet for me, so that I haven't said anything that's that's too stupid or even worse, offensive.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Denise wants to know, what made you decide on the Irish component of Cork's heritage?
So here's the evolution of Cork O'Connor. Long before I began to write the first book in the series, or before I knew, what the hell I wanted to do, I just had in mind a guy that I might want to write about. And all I knew about him at that point in time was that he was going to be the kind of guy who was so resilient that no matter how far life pushed him down, he would always bob back to the surface, and his name would be Cork.
Mm-hmm.
Swear to God, that was the first thing. I told that to an audience not too long ago, Brandon, and some wise ass in the audience said, "Why didn't you just call him Bob?" So that was the first inkling I had of Cork. Then when I decided I was going to set my work up north and include the Ojibwe as an element of it. You know, when you're a writer of fiction, what is it you're looking for? You're looking for conflict, because it's conflict that drives great stories. What is it that drives Romeo and Juliet? It's that conflict between the Montagues and the Capulets, in which our star-crossed lovers find themselves caught. Moby Dick, Ahab and that white whale, you know, conflict, conflict, conflict. So when I thought about the whole issue of conflict, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to create a character who, in who he was, could mirror the conflict of the two dominant cultures in the North Country, Ojibwe and Euro, white. So I knew he was going to be of Ojibwe heritage. Then the question was, what would his Euro heritage be? And if you are of mixed heritage in the North Country here in Minnesota, you could be Ojibwe Finn, Ojibwe Swede, Ojibwe Slav, Ojibwe German, Ojibwe Russian, you name it. And for a variety of reasons, I decided to make Cork Irish. And Cork O'Connor, Cork became very naturally then Corcoran O'Connor. That's the evolution of Cork.
Okay. Steve says, I like the way you use Cork as a living conduit to allow American Indian spiritualism to become a central moral component of your storylines. Can you talk a little bit about why you do that?
Do you know, it's impossible to immerse yourself even as an outsider, but, you know, particularly as a person of a native indigenous community. It's almost impossible to immerse yourself in the culture without being so tremendously aware of the spiritual nature of everything about the indigenous communities, at least those that I've had the great good fortune to be connected with. And so it's difficult to write it seems to me difficult to write a story that somehow doesn't reflect the depth of that spirituality, that native spirituality. You know, my own ideas about, you know, I love the Ojibwe word, Kichimanadu, great spirit, or I love even better the way it has sometimes been translated to some of my Ojibwe friends say, the creator or the great mystery. I love the great mystery because that kind of says it all for me. And the Ojibwe don't try to parse it all out and understand it all. They simply embrace the fact or their belief, and my own belief now as well, that there is a great spirit that runs through everything that connects. This spirit connects everything and everyone. And I'm so deeply grateful to the work that I've done with the Ojibwe, because it's really opened me to that idea, which for me is such a comforting idea.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things about the series is that it's not only a traditional mystery with action and something to figure out, but the lore and the spirituality and the fantastical nature of the mystery just keeps you connected. It's beautiful. It's one of my favorite things.
Well, thank you, Brandon.
You are welcome. Kind of on that same realm, Murda is saying the beauty of the land and the spiritual connection the characters have to it are both a backdrop and sometimes almost characters in their own right. But there are also issues around lost jobs and economic challenges for the area, and then conflict between development and conservation, which you briefly touched on. And Murda wants to know, how do these perspectives inspire or shape your writing?
Do you know, the North Country, that was so insightful. The North Country is an area of conflict. You know, again, I told you that's what fiction writers look for, conflict. And the North Country is an area rife with conflict of all kinds. Traditionally or historically, the wealth in the North Country came from reaping the land, clear cutting the timber. The great pines just don't exist up there anymore. The great white pines that were, 10 feet in diameter and those kinds of things, they were cut down. Mining industry, which devastated the landscape up there. Back in the old days, if you looked at the landscape of northern Minnesota, the Mesabi Range, the Cuyuna Range, the Vermilion Range, it looked like the surface of the moon because of all of the mining that was going on and the tailings and the destruction. But great wealth came out of it, and people up there shared in that wealth. If you go up to some of the the mining towns up there, some of their public buildings are just marvelous because there was a lot of money available to create these, the high schools and the courthouses and those kinds of things. But the mining industry is a small part of what it used to be, and so a lot with the closing of mines and with the advent of mechanized mining, people have lost their jobs up there. People who have come from generations of miners aren't mining anymore. The jobs just aren't there, and so they have to look for other ways of employment, or they have to abandon their homes, and that's happened as well. So we have an ongoing battle up north because there are vast reserves of precious metals yet untapped. And those are particularly close to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness. And there are very deep pocketed companies trying to get permission to begin mining in that area. And the kind of mining they want to do is sulfide mining. And the problem with sulfide mining is that it carries the very real risk of drastically polluting the waters up there, these pristine waters. And so there's a battle that goes on between those people who want to protect the North Country and the resources up there, and those who recognize that economically it would be a wonderful thing to have mining come back. So I try to show both sides of that issue. I have my own personal feelings about that, but I try to give both sides a fair hearing when I write a story about it. And the same is true with the logging industry or any of the issues that I write about that represented a division in the people up there, in the communities up there.
Do you spend a lot of time in the Northwoods?
I don't do. When we first moved to Minnesota and discovered that the North Country, we were up there all the time because it's so stunningly beautiful. And you can't walk in the Great Northwoods without feeling the spirituality of the place. The soul of the Northwoods is so comforting. It gives you such peace. But I don't get up there the way I used to because as my renown has grown, I have begun to do more and more and more events. Typically in a year, I'll do 60 to 100 events across the country. And so I don't have the time to get up north. But I always make sure I'm up north in a season in which a Cork O'Connor novel is going to be set, because I want to know, what are people talking about up north in that season? What are they wearing? What are the colors? What are the smells, the scents, fragrances in the air? I want to get it right. So I'm always up there in the season in which the next story I'm going to write will be set.
Mm-hmm. Makes me think of Iron Lake. Like it's the snowstorm that it opens with.
I wrote Iron Lake. One of the things I set out to do in Iron Lake, I'm not native to Minnesota, but when I moved here, I discovered those legendarily bitter winters here. They're true. And when I discovered what it was like to live through an epic snowstorm, I really wanted to share that knowledge with the world. So, and with Iron Lake, I really wanted to write a cold book.
You succeeded. So we have quite a few people asking about Cork aging. And so Michael and Robert both specifically say many of the characters are old or have died. We won't spoil anything. How will you deal with this? Will you promote story characters, or will you introduce or develop new characters to keep the series going?
Yeah, for those of you who aren't familiar with my series, the 19 books currently in the series span about 15 years in the lives of the characters. When I wrote the series, I pictured Cork as a man of about 40, as I was when I started the series. And Cork has aged 15 years, so I'm writing him now in his mid-50s. His children were quite young. The youngest, Stephen, was 5 years old when I introduced him. Now he's, my current novel, he's 23. Because the current novel I'm working on takes him even a little farther. One of the best decisions I made when I set out to create the series and create the characters was the decision, to have them age. But here, Mystery Writing 101. I contend that if you create a series with a central protagonist at the heart of it, you only have two choices in the kind of protagonist that you can create. You can create a static protagonist, or you can create a dynamic protagonist. What's a static protagonist? That's somebody who never changes. That's somebody who's the same book to book to book, story to story to story. Think Sherlock Holmes. You've read one Sherlock Holmes story, he's going to be the same guy in every story you read about Sherlock Holmes. What's a dynamic protagonist? That's somebody who does change. That's somebody who ages. Somebody for whom what happens in one entry in the series is reflected in how that character responds to the world in the subsequent entries in the series. Um, so, so every time I sit down to write a Cork O'Connor story, I'm writing about different people. They're not the same people they were in the last book or the last books, because things have happened to them. Not just age, but their experiences has changed how they see themselves, how they see the relationship with the world, how they see the relationship with one another, which I got to tell you, Brandon, is part of what keeps it fresh for me.
Yeah.
You know, I'm on a journey whose end I don't see, I don't know. And I'm discovering sort of this territory and the trajectory of these characters along with my readers. I have introduced particularly in Fox Creek, I introduced an additional two major characters who will be significant in the series going forward. And more in the series, I have included Cork's family as a part of everything that happens. So it's not just I think of the series now as the O'Connor saga. It's the saga of the O'Connor clan, because all of the children now play significant parts in most of the stories.
Thank you. That makes sense, and I'm glad that he's a dynamic protagonist. Ed Ed and several others. We had this question a lot. Have you been approached by any of the like major networks about a TV series or a film, and is it going to happen?
Well, those are two different questions. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I've been dealing with Hollywood since my first novel, Iron Lake, came out. Have you seen anything on the big or small screen yet? No. That's because very often we have been very this close, and then things fell apart, or for whatever reason, one side or the other backed out. I just backed out of a deal we had for a movie version of Ordinary Grace for a variety of reasons. I was the one that backed out of that one. But funny thing you should ask. When I was doing you talked about all of these rural libraries, small community libraries that I was doing a tour of and still have some ahead of me. As I was coming out of one of those libraries and heading to my car, my cell phone rang, and it was my agent. And she wanted to tell me that we have agreed upon a deal for a television series for the Cork O'Connor series.
Ooh.
Now, don't anybody believe that, and I won't believe it until I see it inked in blood, that contract, because we've been this close before. But I actually think this has a pretty good shot at going forward. I really like the people who want to do the series, and so I'm kind of keeping my fingers crossed. But I got to tell you honestly, everybody honestly, I don't care if my work ever reaches the big screen or the small screen. What's most important to me is that if somebody does attempt to translate my work to the screen, that they're true to the heart of the stories. My books will always be my books, and I would rather have them remain printed rather than on film. If something, rather than having them screwed up.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That remain true to the nature of the work. I completely agree. That's often where things go wrong in film and series, is when you just lose what the true message is in the writing.
Yeah, I have a few friends who have been pleased with what has happened when the work's been translated to the screen, but the vast majority of them have not.
So, Peter, I'm going to kind of transition a little bit here, and I think this is a good question to do so. Peter is saying, do you see any connections between your Cork O'Connor series and your standalone works like Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land? Basically, asked in another way, he says, Is there something that is fed or nourished by within you by the latter works that the murder mystery series doesn't get at?
That's a really good question. That's a very perceptive question. And the answer is yes. The standalones feed my heart. The standalones are a much larger canvas for me to paint on. They allow me to approach my work in a much freer way than the Cork O'Connor series does. There are advantages and pitfalls to writing a popular series. Advantages: you don't have to recreate the wheel. You have all of your characters pretty well set. Readers are familiar with them. Sense of place is already there. All of the elements of the stories readers are familiar with and expect. When you bring out a new novel in the series, it sells the backlist. That's something publishers love about it. The pitfalls are that you are constricted in certain ways in terms of the stories that you can tell because of the expectations. And so I know that when I write a Cork O'Connor series, it has to have these particular elements involved in it. Somebody has to die, because that's what I do in those works. There are expectations that I have to meet. When I write a standalone, it's very different. I'm really mostly trying to please myself and write those stories that are larger and really have been with me somewhere inside me for a very long time, and have been crying for a way out, and finally here they come. So I derive a great deal more satisfaction as an artist and as an individual from the standalones that I create. I love Cork O'Connor. I love Henry Meloux. I love the family. I love the Ojibwe. I love writing about the North Country. But my heart really is in a different place.
Thank you for that. And thank you for that question, Peter. So, let's kind of move on to the standalones then. Can you give a short synopsis of Ordinary Grace? And Angela and Carrie and many others would also like to know your inspiration for the story.
Sure. Ordinary Grace. Ordinary Grace is set in the summer of 1961 in a small town deep in the very beautiful Minnesota River Valley. It's the story of a Methodist minister whose beloved child is murdered. That's the compelling mystery component. But at heart, it's really the story of what this terrible tragedy does to this man's faith, his family, and ultimately the entire fabric of the small town in which he lives. I wrote to Ordinary Grace because for anybody who's read the Cork O'Connor series, you might have picked up on the fact that there is very often in the story an undercurrent that deals with the spiritual journey. It's something that comes very naturally for Cork O'Connor because he's a man with a foot in two different spiritual traditions: his white Catholicism, he's Irish Catholic, and his Ojibwe spirituality. And so very often in the stories, he's trying to figure out where his unique spiritual path lies. And that's been an issue for me my whole life. And I wrote Ordinary Grace in large part because I wanted to be able to explore more deeply the importance of the spiritual journey in our lives. That was one reason I wrote it. But the other reason I was looking for a story that would allow me to go back and remember an important summer in my own life, the summer I was 13 years old. It's an important period for all of us, men and women. We're on the threshold of our adulthood. And for a lot of reasons I won't go into right now, I have vividly remembered the summer I was 13 years old. And I wanted to find a story that would allow me to go back, recall that summer, and evoke it in such a way that I could use bits and pieces of my own life, my own experience, to create this story. So for those of you who have read Ordinary Grace, the Drum family at the heart of the story, that's my family. The town of New Bremen that I created for the story is so like the small Midwestern towns where I spent my adolescence. I pulled places that were important to me and put them in the book. I pulled people out of my past and used them as characters in the story. And I wanted to write that in such a way that even readers who were born decades later could read Ordinary Grace and know what it was like to be a 13-year-old boy in a small Midwestern town in the summer of 1961. So that's really where Ordinary Grace came from.
Karen says, thank you for writing Ordinary Grace.
Well, you're welcome. It's for me, it has been a very special book. The journey of the writing it was part of the journey, but what has happened and the reception that readers have given it, and the people who have contacted me and told me what it's meant to them, has been the journey. The journey keeps going.
Yeah. She continues that it's one of the most beautiful novels that she's ever read. And she says, I'm curious about and marvel at your ability to navigate with such perspective and immediacy. Frank, as narrator, now in his 40s, brings us into his life as a child, as well as the reality of many other characters. You use language a child wouldn't use, and yet it works and gets right into the heart of things. So what makes this so believable? Is it alchemy?
Do you know, Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land are both narrated by essentially 13-year-old boys. And I have no trouble really getting into capturing the voice of a male adolescent, because I firmly believe that men never really mature much past 13 years of age. So I have enjoyed capturing that voice, that narrative voice for both Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land. They feel authentic to me as voices, and she touched on the storytelling technique that I used in both of those stories. They are both told by older people, older men, looking back on a time when they were younger, 13 years old. And what that allows me is it's that dual perspective. So although the narrator is of an age having acquired more wisdom, you can then integrate that with the voice of the younger person. So you have that the younger person speaking for the most part in the younger person's voice, but occasionally the older voice will interject something, that a piece of wisdom or a word, because it's the older voice that is in fact telling the story.
Barbara says Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land are by far her two favorite books ever. And
Ever. I like that.
Darla says, I loved reading This Tender Land. And can you talk a little bit about this book and what inspired you to choose such a topic and the development of your themes?
You know, when I was a very young kid, when I was in the fifth grade, our teacher read to the class The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. She did it by reading half an hour after lunch every day. I love that book. There was this kid, he was just like me, and he was out there on the Mississippi River having these really great adventures. And of course, after that, I had to read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which I loved even more. And across my entire career as a writer, I have wanted someday to write a story that would pay homage to Mark Twain, that might be in its own way an updated version of Huckleberry Finn. So here's the down and dirty on This Tender Land. It takes place in the summer of 1932, deep in the Great Depression. It's the story of four orphans running from the law because they've committed a terrible crime, but for the right reason. They know if they take to the roads to get away, they'll be caught quickly because a huge manhunt has been launched to capture them. They're afraid to ride the rails, as everybody was doing back in the Depression, because the railroads back then were patrolled by private cops called bulls. And the bulls had a reputation for being incredibly cruel. So the kids are afraid to ride the rails. Instead, they decide to take to the rivers. They canoe a river called the Gilead to the Minnesota River. They canoe the Minnesota River to the Mississippi. And their plan is to canoe all the way down the Mississippi River to St. Louis, where they believe they have family and they'll be safe. My updated version of Huckleberry Finn, the Great River adventure. And so that was a story that has been in my heart since I was in the fifth grade and wanted to write.
That's wonderful. So Kathy's asking about whether or not you can discuss your faith and how it connects with Ordinary Grace.
Well, yeah. I think said it best in This Tender Land. The epilogue of This Tender Land. I'm going to read the epilogue of This Tender Land, the opening scene, the opening words. It'll take just a moment. Here's how I open the epilogue to this tender land. There is a river that runs through time and the universe, vast and inexplicable, a flow of spirit that is at the heart of all creation, and every molecule of our being is a part of it. And what is God but the whole of that river? So, my spirituality right now is pretty simple. I believe that there is this great spirit that runs through all creation, no matter how large or how small. And when we're born, it's a great heart. And when we're born, we come out of that great heart, out of that great spirit. And while we're here on earth in this flesh, we are never alone. That spirit is always with us. And when we die, we simply go right back to the place we came from, that great heart. That really states everything that I believe spiritually. Um, we are we're connected to the past, we're connected to the future, we're connected to one another, and we're never alone.
It's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for answering that question. I think this is going to be a really hard question. It's not very substantive as far as like, is it going to be hard to ask? But it might be hard for you to answer, which is Doreen would like to know, and the rest of the world, what was your favorite book to write?
I have two, and they're behind me. They're behind me.
The two standalones?
Yeah, Ordinary Grace and This Tender Land are my favorite novels by far. The River We Remember is right up there with those. It will be coming out in September, and it's another book. It's another epic story with a really powerful theme at the heart of it. So those are my favorites. Inside, if you wanted to know what my favorite Cork O'Connor novels are, Ordinary Grace or Iron Lake, because it was my first child. Thunder Bay, for those of you who've read Thunder Bay, because it's the story of how Henry Meloux became the wise individual he is, and Lightning Strike, which came out 2 years ago, because it's the story of Cork when he was a 12, 13-year-old kid, back there in that adolescent voice.
I was going to ask you if in the River We Remember, is it also narrated by a 13-year-old boy?
No. It's a very different story.
Okay. So who are your favorite authors, or maybe put a different way, if everybody had to run out to the library right now and check out something that wasn't your book, what would you tell them to get?
To Kill a Mockingbird.
Okay.
I think it's the most nearly perfectly told story. I know that in the current culture there are some issues with it, and I understand that. But it's probably the one book that I go back and reread about every other year. Harper Lee gave us some of the most memorable characters in all of American literature: Jim and Scout and Atticus Finch. What a great hero. The themes are important. The sense of time and place is profound. The language is so beautiful. If I could have written any book not my own, it would have been To Kill a Mockingbird. So that's one of them, because I'm from Minnesota and I love the work of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Go out and pick up The Great Gatsby and give it a read if you haven't. And if you have, give it a reread. It's a terrific story. It's so lush in its language.
There are a lot of those that I read either in high school or my early 20s that I definitely need to reread now at a different place in my life. So.
Yeah, I have to be honest with you, Brandon. When I'm able to choose what I don't often have a chance to choose what I prefer to read. I'm usually reading other books to offer a dust jacket quote. But when I have a chance to choose, I will go back and reread the books that help me appreciate the power of the written word.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you for those suggestions. So I think since we're a minute from the top of the hour, I'm going to close with Holly's question, which is, what kind of wine are you drinking?
when I do a virtual event in this way, I do lots of book clubs, and I encourage all the book clubs to discuss their books with a little bit of wine because it helps all of the discussion flow. This is a Sauvignon Blanc, a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. I love Sauvignon Blancs, particularly those from New Zealand.
Me too. Me too. That sounds great. So let's end this chat so I can grab one. So thank you so much for joining us today, Ken. It truly has been a pleasure to speak with you for the last hour. So thank you so much.
Oh, you've been so delightful, Brandon. And thanks to everyone who tuned in to hear us.
With that, I also want to echo that and extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in, all of our new viewers, all of our repeat. Thank you so much. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, below the live stream, there's a lot going on below the live stream. Just so you know, Kent, below the live stream video, you can find a link to Ken's most recent books. We look forward to seeing you all on May 3rd when we chat with New York Times bestselling author Britt Hawthorne, and again on May 10th when we chat with Academy Award nominated screenwriter and celebrity comedian Jenna Friedman. You can register for those events and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler, and thank you for joining us. Have a good night.